The winter wind swept across the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front in late 1942. Smoke rose from shattered villages, and the guttural roar of Panzer engines echoed across the battlefield. Inside one German armored camp, captured American weapons lay scattered on a wooden table, strange tubular launchers with crude sights and wires. The soldiers gathered around them laughed. "They look like toys," one panzer gunner scoffed, prodding the contraption with a gloved hand. Others nodded in agreement. Compared to the thick steel of their Panzer IVs and the looming presence of the Tiger Eye, this odd weapon seemed laughable. To the Germans, these so-called bazookas posed no threat. They were little more than novelties, an infantryman's fantasy of striking down a tank with a shoulder-fired tube. German propaganda fueled this confidence. Newsreels portrayed panzers as indestructible beasts, rolling unhindered across the front lines while enemy weapons clattered harmlessly against their armor. Leaflets circulated among the troops emphasized that German steel and German spirit outclassed every Allied innovation. The Reich, it seemed, had nothing to fear from the bazooka. Yet behind the bravado, the tide of war was shifting. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa had opened with rapid victories, but by late 1942, German momentum was faltering. The Red Army's resilience and the brutal winter had slowed the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, far from the icy fields of Russia, another front had opened, in North Africa. It was here, during Operation Torch in November 1942, that the bazooka made its combat debut. American infantry, newly landed in Morocco and Algeria, carried the ungainly M1 rocket launcher, a weapon born from U.S. experiments with shaped charges and rocket propulsion. The design was simple, a 5-foot tube firing a 2.36-inch rocket propelled by a small motor, capable of piercing roughly 75 millimeters of armor at close range. For American soldiers facing Vichy French tanks and later German panzers, the bazooka inspired mixed emotions. Some praised its portability, marveling at how a single man could carry a weapon capable of threatening armor. Others cursed its unreliability, misfires, poor accuracy, and limited penetration against heavier German models. In the words of one U.S. infantryman, paraphrased years later, it felt like holding the future, but one that didn't always work. German intelligence officers observed closely. Captured examples were shipped back to Berlin for examination. Engineers acknowledged its ingenuity, but dismissed it as too weak to matter. After all, the Panzer IV G had recently been upgraded with 80 mm frontal armor, while the mighty Tiger Eye, with its 100 mm thick frontal plates and 88 mm KWK-36 gun, was entering service. Against such machines, the little American tube was a mosquito sting. Still, the bazooka represented something larger. It was a symbol of America's growing industrial might. In Detroit and Pittsburgh, factories capable of producing thousands of tanks, planes, and weapons were now turning their focus fully to the war. The bazooka was not perfect, but it could be manufactured cheaply, issued widely, and improved rapidly. In the calculus of modern war, quantity and adaptability mattered as much as raw power. The German tankers who jeered at the captured launchers could not foresee how their laughter would one day fade. They could not imagine a battlefield where every hedgerow or ruined city block might conceal an infantryman with a tube capable of igniting their panzer. For now, their confidence remained unshaken. To them, armor was king, and the Reich's tanks were untouchable. But history held a cruel irony. Within a year, German engineers would transform their mockery into imitation. By 1943, the bazooka's design would resurface in a far more menacing form, an 88 mm rocket launcher that German infantrymen would wield with deadly effect. The weapon they once ridiculed would become their own desperate answer as the Allies pressed closer to Berlin. The laughter of the Panzer crews in 1942 marked not just arrogance, but the beginning of a new phase in the war, an escalating duel between tank and infantry, between armor and the weapons designed to destroy it. What began as mockery on the frozen steppes would echo in fire and smoke across Europe, as the age of portable anti-tank warfare was born. The laughter of German panzer crews echoed across the Eastern Front in 1942, but half a world away, American engineers were working furiously to give their infantrymen a fighting chance. The tank had become the terror of modern battlefields, and rifle fire, grenades, or light artillery were no longer enough to stop armored spearheads. The U.S. Army needed a weapon that could be carried by a single soldier, yet still pierce the steel of enemy tanks. Out of this urgency came the weapon that soldiers would nickname the Bazooka. Its roots stretched back to the interwar years, when Colonel Leslie Skinner and his colleagues experimented with rocket-assisted projectiles. Their breakthrough came with the shaped charge principle, explosives funneled into a conical cavity that could focus energy into a narrow jet capable of burning through armor plate. By 1942, American designers paired this warhead with a simple rocket motor and an open-tube launcher, creating the M1 rocket launcher. Crude in appearance, it was 5 feet of steel tubing, fitted with rudimentary sights and a shoulder rest. Yet for the first time, infantry could carry a weapon that promised to defeat a tank without calling in artillery. The bazooka's battlefield debut came in November 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa. American troops stormed ashore in Morocco and Algeria, bringing with them crates of these new weapons. Against Vichy French forces and later German armored units, the bazooka was put to the test. The results were mixed. In the dust and chaos of North African combat, some soldiers hailed the weapon as a miracle. A single man, crouched behind a sand dune, could launch a rocket capable of knocking out a light tank or an armored car. One infantryman later recalled in a paraphrased letter, "It gave us courage, the feeling that we weren't helpless against steel." But others cursed it. The rockets were unstable in flight, often veering off target. Their penetration was limited. Against older tanks such as the French Renaults or early German Panzer IIIs, they proved effective, but against upgraded Panzer IVs with thicker armor, the rockets too often bounced or detonated harmlessly. Misfires plagued units, and the primitive batteries that powered the launch mechanism were unreliable in desert heat. A sergeant training new recruits rode in frustration. It's a gamble. Sometimes it works like a wonder, sometimes not at all. Still, production surged. By early 1943, tens of thousands of launchers and hundreds of thousands of rockets were rolling off American assembly lines. The weapon was light, cheap, and easy to mass produce, qualities that suited America's wartime economy. Soldiers drilled with it in camps across the United States, awkwardly balancing the long tube on their shoulders, learning to judge distances, and memorizing firing commands. Manuals emphasized teamwork. The bazooka was best operated by a 2-man crew, one to aim and fire, another to load. The Germans, meanwhile, took notice. Captured launchers from North Africa and later from the Italian front were sent to German test facilities. Engineers examined the weapon closely, intrigued by its simplicity and the shaped charge warhead. Yet frontline troops remained dismissive. Reports from panzer divisions mocked the bazooka's small rocket as incapable of threatening their heavy tanks. To them, it was nothing compared to the 88mm flak gun or the thick armor of the Tiger. The irony was sharp. While German crews derided it in the field, their weapons designers saw in it the foundation of something far more powerful. The bazooka was, in truth, a weapon ahead of its time. Its flaws were glaring: weak penetration, poor accuracy, fragile batteries. But its concept was revolutionary. It introduced a new dimension to modern warfare: portable, rocket-propelled anti-tank firepower. It represented the democratization of tank killing, placing the ability to stop armor into the hands of ordinary infantry. As American troops prepared for future campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and eventually Normandy, the bazooka became a standard part of their arsenal. Soldiers learned to adapt, aiming for side armor, tracks, or ambush positions rather than frontal assaults. Engineers in the United States rushed to improve the design, leading to upgraded models like the M9, with better sights and improved firing mechanisms. By the close of 1943, the bazooka was no longer a novelty. It was a fixture of U.S. infantry units worldwide. And across the front lines, German engineers were quietly working on their own response. The seeds had been planted. Soon, from the ashes of ridicule would emerge a far deadlier weapon, one that German soldiers themselves would carry into battle. The American bazooka had entered the war with flaws, but its arrival had not gone unnoticed. Captured examples from North Africa and Sicily made their way to German test ranges, where engineers examined the strange tube with cold precision. By late 1943, they had drawn their conclusions. The weapon was crude, but its concept was revolutionary. If scaled up, it could become a nightmare for enemy armor. What the Panzer crews had mocked as a toy would soon be reborn in Germany as a far more menacing creation. The result was the Raketenpanzerbüchse 54, literally rocket anti-tank rifle, but known to soldiers by a name that carried far more weight: Panzerschreck, the tank terror. It dwarfed the American Bazooka. Instead of a 60mm rocket, the Panzerschreck fired an 88mm high-explosive anti-tank round, inspired by the same caliber that had made the German 88mm flak gun legendary against armor and aircraft alike. The shaped charge of this rocket could penetrate up to 200mm of armor, enough to punch through the sloped plating of a Soviet T-34 or the frontal hull of an American Sherman. Testing began on ranges outside Berlin and at Wehrmacht proving grounds in East Prussia. Reports from the trials were emphatic. This weapon worked. Unlike the bazooka, which was often unreliable, the German copy struck with devastating force. But its size carried drawbacks. At nearly 1.6 meters long and weighing over 11 kilograms, it was awkward to maneuver. When fired, it belched a cloud of smoke and flame that revealed the shooter's position. Worse still, the backblast was so intense it could burn or blind the operator. Early crews wore protective masks and heavy clothing to shield themselves, but accidents were common. Eventually, designers bolted a metal blast shield onto the launcher, a distinctive feature that gave the Panzerschreck its menacing silhouette. Despite its hazards, the weapon entered service in late 1943, first appearing in limited numbers on the Eastern Front. It was here, against the endless waves of Soviet armor, that it earned its grim reputation. Soviet crews described their shock in captured diaries. One tanker noted how a single German soldier, hiding in the rubble, destroyed our lead T-34 with a rocket. We had thought such things impossible. For the first time, ordinary German infantry could stand toe-to-toe with a tank without relying on heavy artillery or dug-in anti-tank guns. By 1944, the Panzerschreck was being distributed widely among Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units. German propaganda reversed its earlier mockery, now praising the weapon as a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon that could halt Allied armor. Training manuals instructed soldiers in ambush tactics, concealment in ruins, coordination with machine guns, and striking tanks at close range before slipping away. Photographs of grinning grenadiers with massive rocket launchers on their shoulders filled newspapers, designed to restore faith in the Reich's ability to resist the Allied tide. But the reality was more complicated. In practice, the Panzerschreck was both terrifying and deeply flawed. Its size made it clumsy in urban fighting, and its smoke trails drew instant retaliation from enemy tanks and infantry. Operators had to be disciplined, firing only from concealed positions and retreating immediately. Still, in the hands of determined troops, it could be devastating. During the battles for the Baltic states and later in Poland, Soviet tank units reported heavy losses to German infantry armed with these weapons. Production increased rapidly. By the end of 1944, tens of thousands of Panzerschrecks and millions of rockets had been manufactured. They were cheap compared to tanks, and Germany desperately needed them as its armored divisions bled away under relentless Allied offensives. What had begun as an object of ridicule had now become a lifeline. Yet the irony remained sharp. The Panzerschreck was, at its core, a child of the bazooka, the very weapon German soldiers had once laughed at. Now, in the ruins of a crumbling Reich, they shouldered their heavy launchers and fired back at the Allies with a design born of mockery. The age of tank invulnerability was over, and as the war moved toward the battles of Normandy and the Ardennes, these dueling cousins, Bazooka and Panzerschreck, would face each other directly on Europe's bloodiest fields. The emergence of the Panzerschreck in 1943 ensured that by the following year, battlefields across Europe had become testing grounds for two rival cousins. On one side stood the American bazooka, light and portable, issued by the tens of thousands to GIs advancing through Italy and later Normandy. On the other side, The German Panzerschreck, larger, heavier, and vastly more destructive, now carried by infantry units fighting to halt the Allied advance. Their clash would define infantry versus armor encounters in 1944. The contrast became immediately apparent during the Normandy campaign of June 1944. American troops landed with M1A1 and M9 bazookas slung across their shoulders. The weapon, by then improved with better sights and firing mechanisms, still struggled against the thick frontal armor of the Panther and Tiger I. Reports from the bocage described rockets bouncing off German tanks or exploding without effect. One U.S. soldier, paraphrasing his after-action notes, admitted, "We aimed at the front, and it just sparked. Only from the sides or rear could we hope to knock them out." The bazooka's true value lay in its numbers and mobility. Every squad could carry one, giving American infantry at least a chance against armor in close terrain. For German troops, the story was different. The Panzerschreck, firing its 88mm rocket, had become a tank killer in the truest sense. In the hedgerows of Normandy, concealed panzer grenadiers waited in ambush, unleashing rockets at close range against advancing Shermans and Churchills. The effect was devastating. Allied crews recalled the sudden flash, followed by an explosion that tore through steel plating. A British officer later summarized his battalion's ordeal. "It was not the tanks we feared most, but the men in ditches with their Panzerschrecks." In Italy, where the terrain favored ambushes and close combat, both weapons played significant roles. American bazookas proved useful against German fortifications, bunkers, and lighter vehicles, but tank encounters remained difficult. German infantry, however, found the Panzerschreck indispensable. It gave them a fighting chance in mountainous passes where tanks often led the way. The smoke and fire of its backblast often betrayed the shooter's position, yet determined soldiers still inflicted painful losses. The most dramatic clash of these cousins came during the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944. In the dense forests of the Battle of the Bulge, snow-covered pines concealed both American bazooka teams and German Panzerschreck squads. Here, the bazooka's limitations were painfully clear. Panthers and Tigers shrugged off frontal hits, leaving American infantrymen to wait for flanking opportunities. Still, the bazooka was ever present, its mobility allowing soldiers to carry it across frozen fields and into village streets. German units, by contrast, used the Panzerschreck to deadly effect, ambushing Sherman columns and leaving smoking wrecks along the roads. German after-action reports boasted of countless armored vehicles destroyed, though these figures often exaggerated reality. The differences between the two weapons shaped battlefield tactics. American commanders soon realized tanks could no longer advance unsupported. Infantry screens, artillery barges, and smoke became essential to protect armor from hidden German rocket teams. German tactics evolved in parallel. Panzerschreck crews operated in pairs or small squads, choosing narrow lanes of fire and withdrawing quickly to avoid counterattack. Manuals stressed patience and concealment. A single well-placed rocket could stop a column. Statistically, the contrast was telling. The bazooka's penetration of 75 to 100 millimeters was adequate against older Panzer III and IV models, but insufficient against Panthers and Tigers. The Panzerschreck, with up to 200 millimeters of penetration, could destroy virtually any Allied tank it faced. Yet the bazooka's strength lay not in power, but in ubiquity. By late 1944, hundreds of thousands had been produced, saturating the Allied armies. Even if many failed, there were always more in the field. On the battlefield, the irony was unmistakable. The Germans, who had once derided the bazooka as a weak and laughable contraption, now depended on its enlarged descendant to stave off defeat. American soldiers, meanwhile, pressed forward with their lighter but less effective original. The cousins faced each other from hedgerows to city ruins, each embodying the philosophies of the nations that built them: mass production versus battlefield efficiency, quantity versus killing power. By 1944, the duel between bazooka and Panzerschreck had become a defining feature of armored warfare in Europe. Both weapons forced a transformation in tactics, proving that no tank could operate alone and that infantry now held the power to challenge steel giants. As the war entered its final stages, this duel of cousins underscored the bitter truth. Innovation born of mockery had reshaped the battlefield forever. By the summer of 1944, the duel between the Bazooka and the Panzerschreck had moved beyond isolated encounters. Now, it was woven into the very fabric of Europe's decisive battles. The Allied landings in Normandy had unleashed a tidal wave of men and machines, while Germany, battered on all fronts, struggled to hold its ground. Infantry versus armor combat reached a new intensity, and portable rocket weapons stood at the heart of this clash. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the close terrain neutralized much of the Allies' armored advantage. Tanks struggled to maneuver through narrow lanes bordered by thick earth and hedges, while German infantry waited in ambush. Panzerschreck teams hid in barns, ditches, and ruined farmhouses. When Shermans rumbled forward, rockets roared from concealment, leaving burning wrecks in the bocage. A German grenadier later described, in paraphrased notes, the exhilaration of watching a rocket slice through a Sherman's side armor. The blast lifted the turret. For a moment, we believed we could stop them. Yet the bazooka was equally vital for the Americans. The weapon's limited power against Panthers and Tigers forced infantry to adapt. GIs crept close through the hedges, aiming at side plates, tracks, or rear armor where penetration was possible. One U.S. infantryman later recalled, "We didn't expect miracles, but when you had no artillery and no tank of your own, the bazooka gave you at least a chance." In countless skirmishes, it was used less as a tank killer and more as a tool to destroy bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified farmhouses. When Operation Cobra was launched in late July 1944, the American breakout from Normandy transformed the campaign. Allied air power shattered German defenses, and armored divisions poured through the breach. Here, the bazooka's ubiquity became evident. Every rifle company carried them. Every platoon trained to use them. They were imperfect, but they were everywhere, a constant reminder that even the smallest infantry squad could threaten armor. For Germany, the picture was grimmer. By late 1944, Panzer losses were mounting faster than they could be replaced. Production of Panthers and Tigers continued, but the Reich's dwindling industry could not keep pace with the Allied juggernaut. Instead, the Wehrmacht leaned increasingly on the Panzerschreck. Entire companies of infantry were equipped with the heavy launchers, relying on them to compensate for the absence of tanks. Their effectiveness was undeniable, but the sheer scale of the Allied advance overwhelmed even the best ambushes. The winter of 1944 brought the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's final gamble. In the forests of Belgium, German panzers once again surged forward, and with them came infantry squads armed with Panzerschrecks. Snow muffled the sounds of movement, and villages erupted into sudden, violent firefights. American bazooka teams fought desperately, firing at close range as Panthers prowled the streets. A U.S. officer later wrote that his men fired until the tubes glowed red, not always stopping the tanks, but buying enough time for artillery to fall. For German infantry, it was one of the last moments of triumph. A grenadier recorded in his diary that the Panzerschreck gave us courage when our tanks were gone. But courage could not replenish fuel or replace shattered divisions. The offensive collapsed, leaving Germany fatally weakened. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet juggernaut pushed relentlessly westward. By 1944, Panzerschrecks were deployed in desperate numbers on the Eastern Front. Soviet tankers remembered with dread the sudden strikes that could disable a T-34 with a single hit. One Red Army veteran recalled how a hidden German soldier fired, and our lead tank burst in flames. We advanced, but each village took lives. Still, Soviet industry dwarfed Germany's. For every tank destroyed, more poured from factories in the Urals. The imbalance of production told the real story. The USSR and the United States could replace losses endlessly. Germany could not. By 1945, the contrast was stark. American bazookas remained a standard infantry tool, issued by the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers had learned to work around its limitations, using it against soft targets as often as against tanks. It was not feared, but it was relied upon. The German Panzerschreck, by contrast, was feared but desperate. It had become the last shield of German infantry, a weapon of survival for a Reich stripped of its armored spearheads. The tide had turned irrevocably. Portable rockets had changed the balance of power between infantry and tanks, but they could not alter the trajectory of the war. The Allies had industry, numbers, and momentum. Germany had ingenuity, but ingenuity alone was no longer enough. As 1945 dawned, the battlefield belonged not to those who wielded the deadliest weapon, but to those who could never run out of them. As the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the story of the Bazooka and the Panzerschreck did not end with the war. Instead, their legacy carried forward into the arsenals, doctrines, and memories of a world forever changed by industrial conflict. What had begun with laughter in German tank camps and uncertainty among American infantry had ended with mutual recognition of a new reality. Portable anti-tank weapons had altered the very nature of warfare. The bazooka, for all its flaws, had proven its worth. It had given ordinary infantrymen a weapon that could, under the right circumstances, destroy a tank. Soldiers who had faced German armor without artillery or tank support remembered it as a fragile but vital lifeline. One U.S. veteran later paraphrased, "It wasn't perfect, but when you were alone in the hedgerows, it was better than nothing." The simple steel tube, once doubted even by its own users, had pioneered a new category of weapon, the man-portable, rocket-propelled anti-tank launcher. The Panzerschreck, though born from imitation, had its own grim legacy. To German infantrymen in 1944 and 1945, it was both a source of pride and a symbol of desperation. Survivors recalled the thrill of watching its rockets tear into Allied armor, but they also remembered the danger of firing it, the smoke, the flame, the constant risk of being spotted and annihilated in return. In the ruins of a collapsing Reich, the Panzerschreck was not just a weapon, but the last line of defense for soldiers facing overwhelming odds. In the years after the war, the lessons of these weapons spread across the globe. The Americans quickly improved their design, producing the M20 Super Bazooka in 1945 with greater range and penetration. It became a standard weapon of U.S. forces in the early Cold War and saw action in Korea, where it was used against North Korean T-34s. The Soviet Union, too, studied captured bazookas and Panzerschrecks, using them as the foundation for what would become the RPG series, weapons that would dominate infantry tactics in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The very concept of the shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket had entered the permanent vocabulary of modern war. The tactical changes they introduced also endured. No longer could tanks operate independently, relying on their armor alone. Infantry support, coordination, and combined arms doctrine became essential. The sight of a single soldier armed with a tube capable of halting a machine weighing 30 tons forever altered how armies planned their offensives. What artillery had been to the trenches of 1916, portable rockets became to the battlefields of 1944, a great equalizer, forcing adaptation and innovation. For veterans, the memory of these weapons was etched deeply. Americans looked back on the bazooka with a mixture of frustration and gratitude, unreliable, often underpowered, but a tool that sometimes meant the difference between life and death. German soldiers, recalling their Panzerschrecks, remembered not only its power but its risks. A former Panzer grenadier summarized it years later. "We feared the tanks, but with the Panzerschreck, we felt we could fight back for a little while longer." The irony of history was clear. The weapon Germany had once mocked became its own desperate hope. The contraption that tank crews laughed at in 1942 had been reborn as a terror weapon in 1944, and its influence would echo for decades. The laughter had long since faded, replaced by the realization that even the mightiest tank could be humbled by a soldier with a tube and a rocket. As the smoke cleared over Normandy, the rubble of Warsaw, and the ruins of Berlin, the world was left with a sobering truth. In war, innovation often comes from what is underestimated. The bazooka, ridiculed as a toy, had helped shape the final years of the greatest conflict in history. The Panzerschreck, forged in imitation, had shown the desperate ingenuity of a nation fighting on the edge of collapse. From toy to terror to legend, their story was not just about weapons, but about the relentless cycle of adaptation in war, where mockery can turn to fear, and where even the simplest invention can change the course of history.